There is a house on Northridge Road in Vermilion, Ohio, that looks from the outside like a fortress. Motion sensors line the driveway. Cameras watch every angle of the property, day and night, recording anyone who so much as approaches the front gate. Window alarms guard every possible entry point, and inside that perimeter, 4 German shepherds patrol the grounds, trained, territorial, and fiercely loyal to the family that raised them. This was not an accident of taste. This was a deliberate, expensive, carefully engineered wall between the Simko family and the outside world. But on the morning of November 18th, 2009, none of it mattered. Because somewhere inside that house, hidden away from the cameras and the sensors and the dogs, was a 14-page document, handwritten, signed, structured with the seriousness of an actual legal contract. But this was nothing like a prenuptial agreement or a business deed. This was a contract of submission, of ritual, of punishment, a master-slave agreement between a husband and a wife in which she was required, in the most intimate moments of their private life, to address him not by his name, not even by a pet name, but as father. That same morning, Jeremy Simko was shot once in the back of the head while he slept. Point-blank range, a .357 Magnum revolver, and as police swept the property searching for the intruder his wife swore had broken in and fled, they found doors locked from the inside, dogs that never barked, and not a single trace of anyone who did not already live there. The greatest threat inside that fortress, it would eventually become clear, was never on the outside looking in. It was already home. It had already eaten dinner at that table, already slept in that bed, already signed that contract in the same handwriting police would spend years studying. And it was bound, in ink and eventually in blood, to a document that Jeremy himself had signed with his own hand. Welcome back to Brian's Criminal Unmasking, where we peel back the polished facades of ordinary lives to expose the dark motives hiding underneath. If deep, psychological breakdowns like this one are exactly why you keep coming back to this channel, do me a favor right now, before we go any further. Hit that subscribe button, tap the notification bell and settle in, because this is one of the strangest, most unsettling cases we have ever covered, and I promise you, it does not let up from here. To everyone who knew them, on the surface, Jeremy and Julene Simko were the picture of a hard-working, all-American marriage. High school sweethearts, the kind of couple people describe as having grown up together, who fell for each other young and never really let go. By the time this story reaches its darkest chapter, they had been married for roughly a decade, and in that decade they built something out of almost nothing. A tree service company that Jeremy ran with total, uncompromising perfectionism. On job sites, Jeremy had a reputation. He was known as a hothead, a man who would curse out his own crews if a job wasn't done exactly to his standard, a boss who was loud, demanding, and did not tolerate sloppiness. He made enemies easily out on those job sites, the kind of small-scale friction that comes from running a business with total control and zero patience for mistakes. But at home, according to nearly everyone who knew the couple, Jeremy was different, devoted, present. He and Julene worked side by side almost every day, managing the books together, running the company together, building a shared life that revolved almost entirely around each other. Friends who knew them both would later describe the two of them, almost eerily in hindsight, as best friends first and husband and wife second. It is the kind of description that gets repeated after a tragedy like this one, and it is also the kind of description that makes what came next so genuinely difficult to reconcile. Because underneath that surface, Julene carried something far heavier than the ordinary stress of a small business and a demanding husband. As a child, she had been sexually abused by her own biological father. This was not a private family rumor whispered about behind closed doors. Her father was convicted of the crime and served time in prison for what he did to her. And Julene, for her part, spent much of her adult life insisting that she had made peace with it, that she had processed the trauma, that she had closed that chapter for good and built a new identity for herself, capable, business-savvy, in control, married to a man who, by all outward appearances, loved and protected her. But trauma of that magnitude does not simply dissolve because a person decides, consciously, that they are finished with it. It settles into the architecture of a life. It waits, sometimes for years, sometimes for decades, for the right combination of pressure, memory, and circumstance to bring it roaring back to the surface. And in a strange, almost unbearable irony, the very fortress that Jeremy and Julene built for themselves out on Northridge Road, the one engineered specifically to keep danger out, may have done the opposite in the way that mattered most. It sealed their secrets in. Behind the motion sensors and the camera feeds and the 4 dogs trained to notice strangers from 100 yards away, nobody on the outside had the faintest idea what was actually happening between the 2 people who lived there. That security system could detect a stranger walking up the driveway before they ever reached the porch. It could not detect what was unfolding in the bedroom. It could not detect a 14-page agreement locked away somewhere inside that home, one that would not surface until long after everything had already gone catastrophically wrong. That contract is where this case stops being a strange domestic tragedy and becomes something almost impossible to look away from. When investigators eventually dug deep enough into the Simkos' private life, they uncovered photo albums and home videos depicting Julene in various forms of bondage. Some of what they found appeared, on its face, to be consensual role-play between 2 adults. But some of it did not sit right with the people reviewing the evidence. In several of the images, Julene appeared to be crying, in visible discomfort. Investigators who later discussed the material said it was genuinely difficult, looking at photographs alone, to determine where consensual play ended and something closer to real distress began. That is the deeply uncomfortable nature of this kind of evidence. Intimate dynamics between 2 consenting adults are, by definition, private, and outsiders are left trying to read pain and pleasure off a still image, which is an imprecise and often unreliable way to understand what was actually happening behind closed doors. Then came the document itself. 14 handwritten pages, structured with the formality of a real legal agreement, outlining an explicit master-slave dynamic between Jeremy and Julene. It laid out rules of submission. It described specific punishments for violations of those rules. It established rituals the 2 of them apparently followed together, privately, inside the walls of that fortress. And at the very center of the most disturbing detail in this entire case, Julene was required, as part of this arrangement, to refer to her husband as father. Sit with that detail for a moment, because it deserves more than a passing mention. A woman whose own biological father sexually abused her as a child, agreeing as an adult within an intimate and consensual power exchange dynamic with her husband, to call him by that exact title, in that exact context. Julene would later maintain, whenever the subject came up, that this was fully consensual role-play, something she chose for herself, something that belonged entirely to her and Jeremy, and to no one else. And under the law, adults are entitled to whatever private, consensual arrangement they choose, no matter how unconventional it might appear to people looking in from the outside. But psychologically, the parallel between her childhood trauma and the language of that contract is almost too precise to be a coincidence. Was this dynamic, for Julene, a way of reclaiming power over the exact kind of relationship that had once been forced on her without any consent at all? Was it, as some who later examined this case theorized, an attempt to rewrite and control a trauma she insisted she had already processed and moved beyond? Or did living inside that role, night after night, year after year, slowly and quietly, reopen a wound that had never actually finished healing, no matter how convincingly she had told herself and everyone around her that it had? There is no way to answer that question with total certainty, And anyone who claims they can read Julene Simko's inner psychology with confidence, this many years later, is overstating what the evidence can actually tell us. But investigators did eventually find one piece of digital evidence that turned that open psychological question into something closer to a countdown clock, ticking toward November 18th. On the home computer, in the hours before Jeremy Simko was killed, someone searched for the online obituary of Julene's biological father, the very man who had abused her as a child decades earlier. Whether he had recently died, or whether someone in that house was simply searching for reasons that would only become clear later, the search itself sits there in the digital timeline like a lit fuse. Hours after that search was conducted, in the dark, quiet hours of the early morning, the balance of power inside that house shifted permanently and violently, and it never shifted back. If you're still watching at this point, do me a favor and drop a comment below with the words, "I'm still here." I genuinely want to see who is following this story all the way through to the end, because it only gets stranger from here. Here's the question I want you sitting with as we move into the next part of this case. Do you think that roleplay contract was a genuine, freely chosen escape that Julene built for herself, a way of taking ownership over something that had once been stolen from her? Or do you think instead that it quietly, slowly triggered something buried so deep in her childhood trauma that eventually, after years of living inside that role, she snapped completely? Type your answer in the comments below. Now let's walk through the morning everything came apart. It was early, not long after 6 o'clock in the morning on November 18th, 2009, when the call came into 911. On the other end of the line was Julene Simko, screaming, sobbing, barely able to get the words out, telling the dispatcher that someone had broken into their home and shot her husband. She told them the intruder might still be somewhere inside the house. Dispatch relayed the call immediately to local police, and officers raced to the property on Northridge Road, guns drawn, bracing for an active and dangerous scene. A potentially armed assailant, possibly still on the property, inside a home that was supposedly protected by a full security system and 4 large, trained dogs. What they found instead looked almost nothing like a home invasion. The doors were locked, not forced open, not pried apart, not broken in any way. Locked from the inside, exactly the way they would be if no one had ever come through them at all. Julene was the only person conscious inside the house, and Jeremy Simko was dead in the bedroom, shot once in the back of the head while he lay asleep with a .357 Magnum revolver. It's worth pausing on that single detail, because it matters enormously to how this entire case eventually unraveled. Most people who break into a home to commit a robbery or even a targeted assault are not walking directly and silently to a sleeping man's bed and pressing a gun to the back of his skull without him ever waking up, without a single sign of struggle, without a single object out of place. That is not the behavior of a panicked stranger who stumbled onto an unexpected victim in the dark. That is the calm, deliberate behavior of someone who already knew exactly where he would be sleeping, and exactly how deeply, and exactly how little warning he needed. And Julene, notably, was not a stranger to how crime scenes work. She had taken college-level courses in forensic science. She was, by multiple accounts from people who knew her, a devoted and frequent watcher of true crime television, the kind of viewer who could likely describe, in fairly precise detail, how investigators process a scene, what physical evidence they look for, and what mistakes amateur criminals tend to make that get them caught. None of that proves anything on its own, of course. Plenty of people enjoy true crime television and never hurt a soul. But that background becomes a genuinely meaningful thread once you look at just how clean, how almost surgically clean, this particular crime scene turned out to be. Because here is everything investigators did not find. They found no forced entry anywhere on the property, not a single broken window, not one jimmied door, not one compromised entry point across an entire home, wired specifically with sensors designed to catch exactly that kind of intrusion. They found no foreign DNA anywhere at the scene, no unidentified fingerprints belonging to any mystery assailant. The 4 German shepherds, trained and territorial dogs who patrolled that property daily and who would reasonably be expected to react loudly to an unfamiliar person creeping through their home in the pitch dark of early morning, never barked. Not once, not for a second. And perhaps the single most damning detail in the entire case, the murder weapon itself, the .357 Magnum, was found resting gently on the kitchen floor. Not dropped in a panic. Not flung aside mid-sprint by an assailant desperate to flee the scene. Placed. Set down carefully, without so much as a scratch on it, in a manner far more consistent with someone deliberately putting it down than someone in a frantic, adrenaline-fueled escape. Put all of that together, and investigators were left staring at an almost mathematically impossible scenario. For an outside intruder to have committed this murder, that person would have needed to bypass a fully monitored, professionally installed security system without triggering a single alarm. They would have needed to walk directly past 4 trained guard dogs without provoking so much as a low growl. They would have needed to enter a fully locked house without leaving a single sign of forced entry anywhere. They would have needed to shoot a sleeping man in the back of the head from point-blank range without waking him or causing any struggle whatsoever. And then, somehow, they would have needed to calmly set the murder weapon down on the kitchen floor before vanishing completely, leaving behind no DNA, no fingerprints, no physical evidence of any kind anywhere on the property. That is not a portrait of a criminal. That is a ghost story. And homicide detectives, no matter how open-minded, do not build murder cases around ghosts. They build them around the people who had access, motive, and opportunity, and increasingly, methodically, all 3 of those things pointed toward the one person who had been inside that house the entire night. Julene Simko. And yet, this case did not close quickly. Far from it. It would take years, plural, before Julene Simko was ever formally charged with anything. In the immediate aftermath of Jeremy's death, something else began quietly troubling the people who had known the couple for years. Friends of Jeremy's started to notice that Julene did not seem to carry the kind of raw, unrelenting grief that most people would expect from a woman whose husband had just been shot to death in their own bed. She did not appear particularly invested in whether the supposed intruder, the killer she had described to police, was ever caught or identified. She never expressed the kind of visible, ongoing anger that friends expected from someone whose spouse had been murdered in cold blood. To people who had known this couple for years, something about her reaction, or her conspicuous lack of one, felt fundamentally wrong. Then, just about a week after Jeremy's murder, Julene did something that would become one of the strangest and most telling moments in the entire investigation. She invited a police officer over to the house. And in the middle of that conversation, seemingly out of nowhere, she told him, "I'd like to tell you what really happened, but I can't." Before the officer could press her further, before that sentence could turn into an actual confession or a real explanation, her attorney intervened and shut the entire conversation down. Sit with the weight of that single sentence for a moment. Not, "I don't know what happened." Not, "I already told you everything I know. But I'd like to tell you what really happened, but I can't." It is an implicit admission that there is more to this story than the version she had already given, spoken aloud by a woman who then chose, on the advice of her lawyer, to seal that story shut for years to come. And it very nearly stayed sealed forever, because the piece of evidence that eventually cracked this entire case open did not come from a forensic lab or a hidden security camera or a break in cell phone records. It came from a nurse. On the morning of the murder, Julene Simko was brought to the hospital, hysterical, shaking, still in the raw emotional aftermath of finding her husband shot in their bed. And in that unguarded, chaotic moment, an emergency room nurse who was present that morning believed she heard Julene say something extraordinary. "I just shot my husband." According to that nurse, Julene almost immediately corrected herself, changing the sentence to "somebody shot my husband." One word, one pronoun. The entire difference between a confession and a victim statement, spoken in the very same breath, in a hospital hallway, by a woman who had either simply misspoken in the chaos of trauma, or who had come within a single word of telling the truth before catching herself. Here is the part of this case that is almost as unbelievable as the crime scene itself. That nurse's account did not reach homicide detectives for 5 years, 5 long years, during which that single overheard sentence sat somewhere in the margins of a hospital worker's memory, unspoken to the very people building a murder case just a short drive away. When it finally did surface and make its way to the investigators working the file, it gave them something they had never had before in this entire investigation. A version of events, straight from Julene's own mouth, spoken in a completely unguarded moment, that directly and explicitly contradicted the story she had been telling everyone since the morning of the killing. With that piece finally in hand, alongside the near physical impossibility of any outside intruder, alongside the 14-page contract discovered in their home, alongside the search for her father's obituary hours before the murder, and alongside years of quiet, accumulating behavioral red flags, investigators finally had enough to bring formal charges. Nearly 5 years after Jeremy Simko was shot to death in his own bed, Julene Simko was arrested and charged with his murder. The trial that followed, held in 2017, came with its own strange and telling twist. Julene made the decision to waive her right to a jury trial entirely, putting her fate instead in the hands of a single person, Judge Mark Betleski of the Lorain County Common Pleas Court. It is an unusual strategic choice in a case this complex, this circumstantial, and this emotionally charged, one that essentially bets everything on persuading a single trained legal mind rather than convincing 12 members of the public. And in another significant decision, one that many observers found telling, Julene chose not to take the witness stand in her own defense. She never personally explained, under oath, in her own words, what that 14-page contract actually meant to her and Jeremy. She never explained the search for her father's obituary hours before the murder. She never walked the court through her own version of the supposed intruder, the locked doors, or the silent dogs. Her defense rested without her voice ever entering the official record. In the end, it did not save her. Judge Betleski handed down a scathing 34-page written decision, laying out in exhaustive, methodical detail exactly why the physical evidence made any outside explanation for Jeremy's murder essentially impossible. He worked through the same logic that had guided investigators for years, that of the 3 theoretical possibilities for who could have killed Jeremy Simko, a random stranger breaking in, a hired assailant, or Julene herself. Only one of those 3 could realistically have walked past 4 territorial dogs without incident, bypassed a fully armed security system without tripping a single sensor, and gotten close enough to a sleeping man to shoot him in the back of the head without provoking any struggle at all. A random stranger would have needed impossible luck and impossible timing, choosing this house, this night, and somehow defeating every layer of security by chance. A hired killer would still have needed to defeat that same security system and those same dogs, guarding against someone they had never met and who had never met them. Only Julene, the person who actually lived in that house, whom the dogs recognized as family and never once questioned, who knew exactly when and how deeply her husband slept every single night, could have moved through that home with the effortless, undetected ease the crime scene demanded. Julene Simko was ultimately convicted of aggravated murder, felonious assault, and tampering with evidence. She was sentenced to 28 years to life in prison, with the possibility of parole only after serving that lengthy minimum term. She was transported from the courtroom first to the Lorain County Jail and later to the Ohio Reformatory for Women, where she remains incarcerated to this day. What makes this case linger, long after the verdict was read and the courtroom emptied out, is not just the impossible physics of that crime scene or the 5 agonizing years it took to finally bring charges. It is those 14 pages that started this entire story, a private contract meant to stay locked away inside a fortress specifically built to keep secrets safe, that ended up telling investigators more about a marriage and ultimately about a murder than either Jeremy or Julene Simko ever intended for anyone outside those walls to know. Julene and Jeremy Simko built a world for themselves defined by strict rules, sophisticated security technology, and a hidden contract that no one outside their marriage was ever supposed to see. But behind those fortress walls, control turned fatal, and in the end, no motion sensor, no camera feed, and no guard dog could protect Jeremy from the one person sleeping beside him every single night. Thank you for tuning in to Brian's Criminal Unmasking. If this breakdown kept you on the edge of your seat, from that very first page of the contract, all the way to the final page of the judge's decision, go ahead and hit that like button right now. Share this video with someone who needs to hear this story, and if you haven't already, subscribe for more deep psychological crime cases just like this one. What do you think was the final straw that night, the obituary search, years of quiet resentment finally boiling over, or something buried in this marriage we will never fully understand? Let me know in the comments below, and I will see you in the next case.